is beyond doubt as a whole other threat, in my opinion. That this is now a systemic effort to basically take the vote away from many Americans and to doubt the credibility of the electoral process. And I'll give you one example. A former colleague of mine, who's now the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, after the election last year, he said, "This has been the cleanest, safest, most secure election in Florida history." And just this week, he was bragging about all the new provisions of the Florida legislature, which would change the way Florida contests its elections. So there you go. I do start with that, not just to remind you what I said 2 years ago. It sounded like I was prescient in some way, but because I'm supposed to speak for 5 to 10 minutes about what's going on in Washington now, and then things that I most enjoy doing, answering questions. And I will say the number one thing on these members of Congress' mind is this very question. Is the question of whether we can sustain, preserve our democracy. Certainly it is, and I know there are a lot of other things in the room. I love you all. But certainly Democrats are preoccupied with this. And you see that with the debate, ongoing debate about the filibuster, whether we should eliminate the filibuster in the Senate. Shouldn't say we, had nothing to do with that. But whether the Senate should eliminate the filibuster, which provides for a 60-vote majority to pass anything, and then pass 2 very significant pieces of voter rights legislation, electoral reform legislation, that would, in our opinion, help to preserve the integrity of elections. That is probably the number one topic that we're discussing. Now, we obviously are discussing the president's agenda. Last week, the president submitted his budget for the next 10 years, primarily for the next year, which obviously is very relevant to my job, because that's my committee. But those things are kind of ongoing issues. Where do we make investments in our country? The president has proposed major investments in our country. And I would argue that he's done something very important. He has changed the order in which we ask questions in Washington. And what I mean by that is that for the last 4 or 5 decades anyway, maybe even longer, we've asked this question first: what can we afford to do for the American people? And then once we've decided what we can afford to do, we decide what to do. Now we're asking a different question, and it is, what do we do to make America's future sound? What do we need to do to serve the American people? Once we ask that question and answer it, then we say, all right, how do we resource that? How do we get the resources to get that done? And that's an important change in mentality. And that's why you see these very significant proposals. One called the American Jobs Plan, which is a combination of major investments and infrastructure, what we would conventionally think of infrastructure: roads, bridges, water systems, broadband, airports, ports, and what the president, and I think many of us, feel is an expanded concept of infrastructure, and that is, what kind of systematic changes do we have to make that will allow the American people to have the best opportunity to thrive? So when we know that we have a huge gap in care for our seniors, that's lack of skilled nursing facilities to lack of a sufficient home health care, and obviously for many seniors, the lack of resources to pay for that. If you are a working person and you have to care for an aging relative, then that becomes part of the infrastructure, because that allows you to go to work to provide for your family. The same thing with child care. That's part of the American Rescue Plan, the American Families Plan, which is the second piece of his agenda. And that deals with all the kind of what we might refer to as human infrastructure. So child care, education, many things that again, will allow the American people to have a chance to realize their full potential. On the education front, and I brought this up 2 years ago, as one of the things I think we needed to focus on intensely now, and that's early childhood education. Under the American Families Plan, every child would get at 3 and 4 years old, would get 2 years of government financed education. A critically important thing for our country to do, in my opinion. Virtually every OECD country does it. In Europe, you start going to school full time at 2.5 years old. We don't do that. We need to make that kind of commitment. But so that's kind of the general statement about what the president's proposed, what many of us fully support. And the issue of how do we resource those things is probably the thing that is being debated most right now. The president has proposed that in terms of the American Jobs Plan, that we pay for it by raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. That we do a variety of other things in the corporate tax area. Republicans have said it's a non-starter for them. They're not going to accept that. The president yesterday made an alternative proposal that there be a 15% minimum corporate tax, which would keep companies like Amazon from paying 0% the income taxes. So they are working together to come up with a mutually agreeable way to resource those programs. On the American Families Plan, the concept is raise taxes on the very wealthiest Americans, those making over $400,000 a year, make some alterations in the estate tax and capital gains tax structure, so forth. My personal opinion is that that has no chance of passing. Those of you who are worried about that, you can exhale now. I really don't think that there's a lot of interest. I mean, I don't think there's unanimity among Democrats as to whether that's an advisable thing to do. So then the question comes, if you can't find the resources to do it, what do you do? And this is part of a much longer topic that I'm not going to discuss today, but it's about making some recommendations. One is, we don't need to find ways to take money from people to pay for what we need to do for people. In this country, because we issue our own currency and because we borrow and spend in our own currency, we can pay for whatever we want to pay for. We just tell the Treasury to pay the bills, to write the checks when the bills come in. And you say, well, what about the debt? $28 trillion. Are we piling that on our grandkids? No, we're not. We're not. This is standard, I will say, conservative rhetoric. And even some Democrats parrot it. Oh, we're putting it on our kids' credit card. We've been accumulating debt in this country for 230 years. Not one person has ever been asked to pay for his or her grandfather's profligacy, right? Never happens. They were saying this, I'm sure, when the national debt reached $1 billion under Abraham Lincoln. I know they were saying it when it reached $1 trillion under Ronald Reagan. Because I heard all that stuff back then. So $1 trillion under Reagan, it's now 28 trillion. Has anybody been asked to pay part of that debt? No, because we don't have to. But again, we have a sovereign currency. We are not like businesses, we are not like families, we are not like state governments, we are not like local governments. We don't have to balance our checkbook. We are like the banker in Monopoly. We create the money, we hand out the money, everybody else plays the game with it. We are one of only about 10 countries in the world who are positioned to do it that way. UK is one, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Brazil, there are a few. But not very many. The European Union can't because they share a currency. We are. And so I will give you one recommendation, then I'm going to shut up and answer questions. There's a book called The Deficit Myth. The Deficit Myth is written by a woman named Stephanie Kelton. And it is basically the best exposition and explanation I've heard or read about what's called modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory is exactly what I just described. When you have a sovereign currency, you can basically do whatever you want, spend whatever you want. The only constraint on your spending is you can't put more money into the economy than the economy can absorb. So theoretically, let's say we wanted to give every family a $200,000 voucher to buy a house. We can do it. We can put out the money, we can create the money, do it. What's the problem with doing that? Well, what would happen to the price of housing? Obviously, there wouldn't be enough housing stocks, and prices would go through the roof and would make that voucher pretty much worthless for a lot of people. So that's the constraint. But what's happened is that over the last 30 years, the Milton Friedman School of Economics, which basically is what we've all been living under for that period of 70 years, has proven to be not true. I mean, we've consistently raised the national debt. We've not had any serious inflation in the country. We have very low interest rates, historically low interest rates in terms of the federal government's borrowing costs. And the dollar is basically been, versus other currencies, as strong as it's been historically. People say, oh, well, in the president's budget, if we were enacted, you'd have debt to GDP would be 117%. It's the highest it's ever been in the country's history. Well, that's true, but Japan has, their debt to GDP ratio is 240, more than twice ours. They have zero interest rates on their bonds. They don't have any inflation. Now, they're not an exact comparison. They have their own problems. But the point is that there are more and more people, more and more economists saying, you know, perhaps we've been looking at this wrong, the issue of debt and what it means. And one of those people is Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who is not a liberal Democrat. He's a Republican appointee. And there are a lot of economists saying this now, that we need to start looking at this differently because it is different than what we have been operating at for the last several decades. So anyway, that book, The Deficit Debt, if you want to have it, it's a great read. It will, I guarantee you, it will change the way you thought about money and debt and borrowing. And you may not still think that relying on MMT is a good idea. And I was a total skeptic when I started studying it. But anyway, I advise that if you want some great summer reading, not exactly, London. But it's written very much for a lay audience. It's not written for economists. So anyway, with that, I will say that's what's going on in Washington, and it's going to be an interesting year and a half, and I look forward to being very much involved in these major issues that we're dealing with. So let's have questions.
Rotarians, if you'd like to come to the mic and ask your questions, please state your name, your organization, so you know who he's talking to, and ask your question.
Hi, Henry.
Thanks for being with us today. I have a tax question relating to the sales and local tax exemption. And every Friday, the Wall Street Journal prints a large section called Mansion, and it has a hedge fund and Hollywood types that are happy to show you their 50, 60, 70, $80 million houses. And I assume these are the people that are lobbying to repeal the SALT tax. Tell us what your thoughts are, please.
Well, I was not supportive of the move to change the SALT tax or limit the deductions. Basically, what they did, limit it to $10,000 a year, because it affected a lot of Kentuckians as well. We have pretty good state income tax, and but it became partisan to a certain extent because Republicans, who were then in charge of the Congress and the White House, as part of their 2017 tax package, said this is a way to get at blue states. So this is the way to get California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts states with fairly high tax rates, property tax and otherwise. And their argument was, and it's not a totally bogus argument, I mean, it's a real argument. They said those states have chosen to give more services to their citizens. Therefore, they have higher taxes. So should the rest of the country subsidize them, allow them to deduct the taxes? The response, of course, is, why should you be penalized for wanting to do more for your citizens if you're willing to tax them? But I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I do believe that there is, even though there have been a couple of Democrats who have said they're not going to vote for any bill that doesn't restore the full SALT deductions, I don't think that's going to happen anyway. So, yeah, I don't think there's going to be a change because there is no Republican. I don't believe there's a Republican who will vote to change it to revert to pre-2017 situation, and there are a lot of Democrats who will be there.
Thank you.
Congressman Vince Cameron, welcome back.
Thank you.
You mentioned in your opening comments when you were here 2 years ago, you were prescient with the greatest threat to national security. I remember your speech, and you said that white supremacy was the biggest threat. And I heard President Biden mention it just the day before yesterday, saying white supremacy is the biggest threat. And you're an 8-term congressman. I know you get classified information, and you know your district. I'm curious, what percentage of your district is white supremacist?
Well, first of all, I've never gotten any classified information on that. I don't get very much classified information. Actually, most of the classified information we get, whether it's regardless of the subject, is stuff that you read in the newspaper the next day. If it's classified, it's not classified for long. So, but I'm not going to make a stab at it because it'd be a totally ridiculous number. And, I do think that clearly white supremacy is a problem in the country. And a lot of it's overt white supremacy, a lot of it's very quiet white supremacy. And I think the important thing to talk about, and I was preparing a longer speech about race today, and then I said, well, 5 or 10 minutes about what's going on in Washington. So I'll deliver that some other time. I think what we have to realize is, yes, there's systemic racism in the country. I mean, all you have to do is see some of these reports right now where a black person who owns a house gets it appraised, it's appraised at $150,000. A white person goes through the appraisal process with offering him or herself as the owner, and it's appraised for $100,000 more. I mean, that's just one example of how much how much systemic racism there is in the country. I think we have to remember, we could have an hours-long discussion on this. I went to Yale. I was very lucky to go to Yale. Years ago, I wrote a piece for Leo about Black History Month, defending Black History Month. And I said, in doing that, I went back and got out my freshman yearbook. And there are 1,000 guys, we were all male then. And to the extent that I could tell, I thought we had a pretty good group of Black students because 2 of them were my fraternity brothers and 1 of them was a good friend of mine. And so I was around Black students a lot. And then when I looked through the yearbook, I realized to the extent you can tell from pictures, there were 10 in a class of 1,000. And 1 of them was Calvin Hill, the All-American football player, and a couple of the other ones were athletes as well. But that stunned me. And then I did something really crazy. I went and pulled out I was amazed I still had it, my college US history survey book, the first big book surveying all of US history. It was written in 1963. It was among the authors were Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Bruce Catton, C. Van Woodward, and some of the most esteemed historians of the time. Look through the book, through the index, there was 1 Black person mentioned by name in the entire 800-page book. The entire history of the country up into that. Booker T. Washington. No Sojourner Truth, no Frederick Douglass, no Jackie Robinson, no Marion Anderson. I mean, it was mind-boggling to me. So you think about the accumulated effect over generations of that kind of, the word's been used too much in the last few days, whitewash of American history. And now a reaction to the 1619 project, via the first slaves who brought to America, the reaction to critical race theory being taught in schools. You just have to say, yeah, that's part of the country. And people get very defensive about having it insinuated that they may be racist. And there was an incredible column yesterday in the Washington Post by a woman named Robin Gibbon. And she talks about the importance of guilt and of dealing with guilt. And I recommend it to everybody. So, it's a long answer to an important question. Yes, there's white supremacy in Louisville, in Kentucky. Do I think that it's a huge percentage who are white supremacists who are out there in the streets, as we've seen in other places? No, I don't think there are a lot of people like that. But I think there are a lot of people who have either because they aren't interested or because they are uneasy, that they just don't want to take the time to think about how big a factor systemic racism has been in our country, and also to learn about African American history. We have, sometime last year, a child was born, and it was the first time the majority of children in the country are non-white. So, and that's a trend that's going to continue. So if you think that we can go on as a country and more importantly as a society, a collection of people who are supposed to interact and get things done together, and we don't understand the backgrounds of all those people who are living with us, then you're not giving our society the best chance of being the kind of place I think we all would want to have, and a kind of place that we've always thought of ourselves as a good.
Congressman Dave Lund. The president is putting forth a major effort to repair and replace deteriorated infrastructure. One issue in Kentucky that has been violently supported by our former governor and many congressmen is the replacement of the Brent Spence Bridge in Cincinnati. Can you put language in the funding for any bills for that Louisville gets an equal shape to the Brent Spence Bridge, so whether it be no tolls or equal tolls?
I don't think I can do the latter. There are some of us who are actually talking about getting that done. I've had conversations with the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Peter DeFazio, about that. In the president's rescue plan, and I keep calling it rescue plan, that's my name's on that side. But on the American Jobs Plan, one that deals with infrastructure, there is a $25 billion fund for what are called critical regional transportation systems. And on several of the lists that I've seen, it's one of the 10 most critical. So on average, $2.5 billion a piece provide. On most of the lists I've seen, Brent Spence is number 2 from critical projects in the country. So presumably, if that were passed and implemented, that the Brent Spence Bridge would get done. Because I think the estimates are about $2 billion to replace it. So I'm optimistic. Yeah, whether we can, we probably can't get language in the bill itself, in the legislative language. What we're trying to do is get language in the report that would bias the designation that requirement. I don't think we could get that passed when we actually identify mandatory spending on 10 different projects, because there'd be a lot of states that would be ticked off.
Congressman Yarmuth, my name is Roland Bonnie. I was wondering, in light of these big bills with T's after them that are passing, apparently both the bodies that project what's going to happen to our economy in the future, say we'll return to 2% or more growth rate within 2 years. How can we spend all this money and have the stimulus of it run out in less than 2 years?
Well, first of all, thanks for the question, Ron, the way the bills are, the bills have not been actually written, so I can't say. The way the president's proposal has been made, the spending on those projects, on all of those programs would be over 8 years. The revenue generated by changes in corporate tax rate would occur over 15 years. So the administration says that those 8 years of spending would be paid for over 15 years. And then if the increases in the corporate rate or changes in the corporate tax structure are kept in place, that will provide funding for many, many years past that. Yeah, I don't know that, I don't think the corporate rate changes that they propose are probably going to be enacted the way he's proposing. But that's kind of the theory. You're not going to get 2.3 trillion is what the president proposed. If you give $2.3 trillion in 1 year, which you couldn't do on infrastructure because projects take a lot longer than that, but if you could, that would probably be dangerous in terms of inflationary impact. But again, it's spent over 8 years. And so last week the president puts out his budget, and the headline was $6 trillion budget. And that's a big number, a lot bigger than we've ever had. Without the president's proposal, it would have been 5.7. That's not something that got mentioned in much of the coverage. So, and that's a reflection of the fact that this money is being spent gradually, would be spent gradually over a year. Does that answer your question? Well, because so you're going to you'll have a significant increase. Right now, we're recovering from a fairly low level, so the percentages of increase in economic activity right now are pretty high because we were way down, right, during the pandemic. So instead of starting with a base, just hypothetically, instead of starting with a base of $20 trillion in GDP, we were starting with a base of 15 trillion. So if you get $1 trillion in growth recovering from the pandemic, you got a 6% increase. It sounds pretty good. But as you recover to a normal level, then the percentage growth just by math is going to be small.
Back to your comments earlier about sort of deficit spending kind of really doesn't matter. And you mentioned that the United States is one of 10 sovereign countries, just to sort of get away with this. When did we achieve that status? I'm assuming that's not way back. When did we achieve that status? And it's still kind of hard to believe that such a thing exists. And I would ask the second part of the question, what if the theory is wrong? Okay, like the consequences of that seem.
That's the first question. That's the first thing. Thank you for that. Well, first of all, it happened when we went up the gold standard. So when the currency was no longer tied to the price of gold, then we became.
But that then why we could have done it as soon as we could have done it the third.
We could have done, yes, we could have done it. We could have done it at any time. So that's the first question I asked when the first time I heard about MMT. I said, it sounds like a great theory that is very appealing until it doesn't work. And so the question of until it doesn't work, I have exhaustively discussed with Stephanie Kelton and others. And at that point, two things have to happen. Either essentially you would have to have a forced recession. So either the Fed would raise interest rates to discourage economic borrowing and economic activity, or Congress would raise taxes to a very high level, pull money out of the economy. That's what you would do if you got to the point where you had untamed inflation. Those are the two answers.
And that's the downside, basically untamed inflation.
Yes, that's the only downside. And I've asked this question. I said, so does the accumulated debt have anything to do with the propensity of a new dollar being spent to cause inflation? In other words, if your debt is $10 trillion or $20 trillion or $50 trillion, does that make any difference in how likely the next dollar spent is to cause inflation? And the answer is no. Why spend it?
Well, that's all.
Yeah.
The other downside though is that X% rolling of the total budget is being dedicated to debt service. So we're paying attention. You can't spend it anywhere else.
Interesting. Well, there are two answers to that. Interestingly enough, CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which makes all these 10-year forecasts, so basically the carrying cost of the national debt is not going to increase significantly over the next 10 years because the interest rates are so low. Secondly, we choose to pay interest on the money that we borrow. We don't have to do that. In other words, China owns $1 trillion worth of our debt. We could say to China tomorrow, okay, China, you have $1 trillion here in an account for you. Do with it what you want, but you're no longer going to get 1% or whatever we're paying on those treasuries. We have the ability to do that at any time. So we can pay off our national debt tomorrow with a stroke, a keystroke. And because people would still choose to trust the United States government with their money for safety reasons. And that's why you had negative interest rates in the EU at one point. The last few years, people didn't have any place to put their money that was secure enough. So they basically, in Europe, they paid the European Central Bank to hold their money for it. So we choose to do that for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into. Read the book. I sound like I'm really flogging the book. I get more lawyers, but it really is. Yeah. So what I love this thing. She said, don't think of $28 trillion as debt. Think of $28 trillion as the total amount that the United States government has invested in its people over history minus taxes. Because $28 trillion, that debt, we created that money, right? When we sell treasuries at the treasury auction, the treasury didn't exist yesterday. That treasury bill, that $1 billion in treasuries didn't exist. The Fed just said, here, who wants to give us money? And here's the treasury we just created yesterday, and now we have $1 billion. So again, I learned so much from reading about this stuff and stuff that people don't think about and relying on old myths and so forth. So anyway.
Congressman, I need for you in my loan office to get together.
As I said before, the federal government is the issuer of money. Everybody else is the user of money. This dynamic does not exist for anybody else. It doesn't exist for individuals, families, businesses, banks, state governments, local governments. It doesn't exist for anybody else who uses dollars. Just the federal government.
I understand. I appreciate that. You can stay away from the loan officer. Dan Hartley, I have a more serious question, actually. Something that doesn't make the news much anymore is what's going on in Iraq. And I pay attention to it because I have a son serving over there. Yeah. And it's a mess. And so my question to you is, when and how do we get the heck out of there?
It's a great question, and I wish I had an answer for you. I have not been briefed, classified, or in any other basis as to what the administration's strategy is with Iraq. And we've got a phenomenal, I think, National Foreign Affairs team now in place. People who are all very experienced, know what they're doing, and I know that there is, if I had to guess, I would guess it's, if we can get back to the Iran nuclear deal and stabilize that situation, then they will see that as a key to our getting out of Iraq. I'm sure that Biden wants to.
Congressman, I almost blurted this out earlier. You got a question about white supremacy and racism earlier, and I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to expand on that and answer that for this group. It's really important. Thank you.
Thanks for saying that.
I bring up the tail end. Congressman, thank you so much for being here. I have a question concerning your view of the QAnon folks, and I use that broadly to include not just them, but the whole kind of alt-right, if you will, and the fervent belief among a lot of people, according to the polls, in which you see that the election was stolen last November. And my question to you is, what is your take on what motivates those folks, and what exactly, as a nation, should we be doing about that? Because from my view, people are living in a fantasy land, and there may be people here in the audience who disagree with that, but they're living in a fantasy land, they're not attached to reality, and that's what's really concerning.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. You want to be here till 1:30? Yeah, 70 poll just this week, over 70% of Republicans believe the election was stolen. More alarming is that 45% of Republican voters, self-identified Republican voters, said that it might be necessary to use force to save our country, essentially. And then you have Michael Flynn, former national security advisor, basically saying that we should have a military coup like Myanmar. If you had to ask me, if I had to guess, and believe me, I've got to deal with a few of these people who are in the Congress. That's not easy, but I think that there's a certain segment of the public that has decided that their political prospects are better if the country's divided than if it's united. And their strategy is to keep the country divided. And some are in it, I think some are in it for kicks, I think some are in it for money, but it's a very, very cynical approach to being a citizen. And yeah, I think you have so many different people. Just quickly, Matt Gaetz, I know. I've had lunch with Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz is, the thing that's most disturbing about Matt Gaetz is he's a fraud. He doesn't believe any of the things he says. He's actually a really nice, humble guy, if you can believe that. I'm not talking about going out with 17-year-olds, that's a whole other issue. But just in terms of the stuff that he and Marjorie Taylor Greene are saying, that go out and call Democrats traitors and so forth. You know, this is Marjorie Taylor Greene raised $3 million in the first quarter for her fundraiser. You can believe that. More than most every other member of Congress. So there's money in it. There's there's a political calculation there as well. And on the media side, there's attention, money, all that stuff. Tucker Carlson is a nightly danger for the country. But all of those things feed upon each other and bolster each other. And that to me is the biggest tragedy of the Trump years, is that he basically gave people license to be very, very public with their prejudices and with their insanity. That's what we're saying. Well, thank you all. Good to see you.
Really appreciate being with us, and especially glad that we could be together in person and happy with us. So thanks for kicking us off. And in closing, we want to say happy birthday to the Rotarians who had birthdays this week. The names are all in Sparks. And the district conference is happening this Saturday. It's not too late to register if you're interested. There's a link in Sparks where you can register, or let Alyssa know, she can help you with that. And as a reminder, next week will be a Zoom-only meeting. And unfortunately, Churchill Downs CEO Bill Cardigan is not able to be with us in person, but we've got a stellar member joining us, Tanya Ben, who's the Vice President of Communications for Churchill Downs Inc. will be with us. So we hope you can join us via Zoom. And I also want to give a big shout out to all the folks that are with us today, Rotarians that are Zooming. We had 30 people in this meeting with us today as well. So I just want to say again, how wonderful it is to see you in person. Appreciate all your wonderful support and all you do in the name of Rotary. We are adjourned.